Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome from the Heinrich-Böll Foundation here in the headquarters in Berlin, and also online, I hope we are online right now, to this event presenting and actually launching in Europe and Germany the publication of our Rio office in Brasilia, The Amazon Speaks, Imaginaries and Realities. This is really the European launch of this publication, and I'm happy to tell you that as of today, the 11th of June, this is also available online in English as a PDF to download, which for me is great because I don't speak Portuguese. This event will be translated simultaneously into English and Portuguese, so you might want to grab a handset, which are over there if you need translation. My name is Julia Scherf. I'm the head of the Latin American department here in Berlin in the headquarters, and I'm very happy that this event can take place in the realm of the Amazon Week by the Brazilian Embassy. It's the second week, actually. The Brazilian Embassy is offering varieties of events around the topic. I think most of them in the embassy, and also in Paris and Brussels in the embassy, so it's a nation project. But we decided to offer our space here and to offer this, have this opportunity to present the atlas from the office in Rio. I'm very delighted to welcome, especially from the Brazilian Embassy, Mr. Felipe Carvalho Raposo. Thank you so much for coming, and also some of the staffers of the members of parliament have made it to this afternoon. Let me tell you one thing about this format, because the format, the atlas, is a format the Heinrich-Böll Foundation has been successfully engaging in for the last at least 15 years, and various issues, various areas. However, this is the first atlas that actually has been produced in the Global South. So it has not been directed and orchestrated from Berlin, as the other atlases were, but really been put together by a very diverse committee of authors, of which the process itself and also the content, certainly we will hear more now in the next 2 hours, in Brazil. So I'm very, very delighted to be presenting this here as a product, actually, from the office, from the Brazilian counterparts. This is also the moment to thank again and again the contributors to the atlas, the office staff certainly, but also those who made this possible, and our many counterparts in the civil society in Brazil working alongside the issues which are presented in the atlas. It is a pleasure also to especially mention Marcelo Montenegro, who is our coordinator in the Rio office, who had the initial idea to actually produce such an atlas of the Brazilian Amazon, to the office director of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Rio, Regine Schöneberg, who actually crucially supported and followed through to make this happen, that this product now exists, and certainly to Julia Dolce, who will be later with us and speaking here on the panel, to Aiala, who also is here, also will be presenting later, and has been part of the editorial board of the Atlas, and certainly to Martin Koy and to Imme Scholz, who will later be also on the panel, going more into the topics. Thank you so much for being here, for contributing, and for really taking most out of the Atlas as possible. Finally, let me mention to you the COP30, which will take place in November in Belém, where actually the Atlas has first been presented in April. There is a little video on the presentation, a very nice one down there, so later when you have lunch, because there will be lunch served after the event, or late lunch, you can have a visual effect on impact on this publication event. It also was launched in Rio in May with a wide audience on occasion of the 25th anniversary, the birthday practically of the Rio office. So we have been using this atlas already in Brazil to such an extent that Julia told me yesterday it's actually sold out. It cannot be sold out because it's not sellable. Obviously, it's a gratis publication, but there are no longer printed copies of it in Brazil available. The COP30 will be the occasion where we also want to enrich and deepen the necessity to differently speak about the Amazon, not only as a resource for the global world, but also as a territory of people who live there and who make possible that actually it still is surviving in the difficult circumstances we are going to hear more about in the next 2 hours. Therefore, I very much now would like to hand over this panel to my colleague Julia Ziesche, who will be moderating this session. Julia is with the Latin American department, is in charge there of Brazil because she has a very strong Brazilian background. She's an anthropologist, a social, political, and cultural anthropologist by training, and has, before joining the foundation, researched the nexus of indigenous rights and climate politics in depth. So I hand over to you, Julia, and wish you all a very interesting and insightful afternoon. Thank you so much for coming.
So welcome also from my side, and I will invite all the guests to the panel right now, starting maybe with Aiala. You can join me on stage, Aiala. Aiala is a geographer at the Pará State University and also a senior researcher at the Brazilian Forum for Public Security. And Aiala was part of the editorial board of the Atlas. And he also contributed with an article on organized crime, which I highly recommend reading afterwards. And Aiala is also the director of the Institute My Crioula, and we will speak about this later on. Now I want to invite Julia Dolce, who was already mentioned. Julia is a journalist and also a photojournalist from Brazil, and she has worked for several Brazilian media outlets. And as a journalist, she works mainly on socio-environmental conflicts, agroecology, and on traditional peoples in the Amazon region and also in the Cerrado region. So looking very forward to hearing more from you today. And as a former Rio colleague, you were a very driving force behind the Atlas, as Julia Scherf already said, as a main organizer, main editor, and so on. So very warm welcome. Please join me and the others, Martin, another geographer who is on the panel with us tonight. Martin is from the University of Innsbruck, and he has focused in his research on sustainability, development research, and human-nature relations. That summarizes not all of your work, but some of it. And you also bring a very extensive research experience on the Brazilian Amazon with you. And last but not least, I will invite Imme Scholz to the stage. Imme is co-president of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and before joining the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in 2022, I think, yes, she was deputy director of the German Development Institute in Germany. And Imme, you're a sociologist by background, and you also bring first-hand knowledge of Berlin, because for your PhD research and also for the work in the German cooperation, bilateral cooperation, you spent almost 4 years in Berlin. So I'm really also looking forward having you here on the panel. And just to let everyone know, the event is divided in 2 parts, and in the first part we want to explore the importance of broadening the debate on the Amazon and including the diversity of its people. And in the second part, which will be a little shorter, we will offer you an outlook on the COP30 and on how the Atlas can actually aid the preparation for the COP30. And in the end, there will be a space for a Q&A, so the audience here in the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Berlin can ask questions. Unfortunately, not the people in the live stream, but that's what you gain by coming here tonight. So diving directly into the first part of the event, I would just quickly mention that when we look at the German public debate, especially in the media, the region, Amazonia, its image is quite narrow. It's not very diverse to our mind, and it focuses mainly on topics such as adventure, but also deforestation, illegal mining, climate, of course, and our atlas, as you will learn today, aims to diversify this debate on the atlas and wants to deconstruct stereotypes about the region. And we are asking, of course, what kind of stereotypes are we talking about? And we will explore this now with our guests here on the panel. And we will intentionally start with the European perspective and then go on to the Brazilian perspective and give more time to Aiala and Julia. And I will actually start with Martin, all over there. I've heard, Martin, that you're good in telling stories. But unfortunately, we don't have so much time for long stories. So I will ask you to be short in your answer to my question. And I don't know if everyone in the room knows already, but you have co-written the first article for the Atlas together with Flavia do Amaral Vieira. And this article is only for the international version and is thought as a bridge article. And why do we need a bridge article from the Brazilian Atlas to the international Atlas? We want to find out. And in your article, Martin, you describe, among other things, that Amazonia has been an important part of global economies for a long time. And you mentioned, for example, the rubber industry. And you also write that the focus on Amazonia is always on the goods that the world market demands, so not the people who live there. And I would ask you please to explain a little bit this thought, maybe mentioning some of these old demands, but also new demands. Thank you.
Well, first and foremost, I would like to apologize that I decided to speak in Portuguese. Well, I don't know if it's easier, but since in the past few months or years even, I've been reading a lot more in Portuguese. It may be easier for me. And I had to make a decision. We're 5, so 2 will speak in English or 2.5. So I decided that we could do it that way. So there will be 3 speaking Portuguese. I hope that's fine with you. I apologize for my German accent. It is a pity that I cannot tell my lovely stories, but one of them I would like to tell, which is important. I came to the Amazon for the first time April 1983, that's 43 years ago. And I arrived there in a very strange fashion. Well, I think most here in Europe and, well, maybe around the world associate the Amazon with the river. So it would have been, the traditional way of arriving, by boat. But I didn't. I got there in a Volkswagen Beetle, Fusca as they're called in Brazil, and I went to the state of Rondônia, the inland of the state. And at the time, the BR 364, Cuiabá Porto Velho, had just been asphalted. I had to put my Beetle on top of a truck, and I think it was 3 or 4 days on top of a truck inside my Beetle. So why do I tell that? Because it shows a transformation which is radical in the Amazon from the river to the road. I think that's one of the breaks. That was maybe the most important rupture in the beginning of the 70s with the decision of the military junta to open the Amazon to the outside influence and to integrate, which is not really an integration, is rather an incorporation. That would be a German word which I would like to include, which is Einverleibung, to bring into the body, really. So the Amazon was placed inside the important interests of the Brazilian nation and the other nations in the world. This is nothing new, and I don't have any more time to mention the whole history, but this starts with the drugs in the 17th century from the sertão of Brazil, and of course with the rubber cycle in the second half of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th. I think there too, Rondônia had its interesting moment where the road, the Madeira-Mamoré Railway, was built, the Devil's Railway, 1907, 1912, which was a negotiation with Bolivia. And when the railway was built, with loss of many, many, many lives, the rubber cycle was over, and the railroad lost its function. This means that it was built for that purpose. So the Southeast Asia had already replaced the rubber in the Amazon. This could continue. We could mention a lot of other events. We could mention the projects of Henry Ford, Fordlandia. We could mention other interests, Daniel Keith Ludwig in the 70s, in the Jari River, etc. And today, of course, we have to think about the extraction of minerals, about the production of beef, and also soybean, especially. Well, my Amazon, sorry if I call it so, is not the Amazon of my colleagues here to my right side. It is the Amazon of the south and southwest, which is Mato Grosso and Rondônia, the two Brazilian states. This Amazon probably is totally different, if I may say so, I'm sorry, from your Amazon. An important point also we have to keep in mind that the Amazon today is not a single unit. It is several and many. That, of course, complicates the picture, especially our European vision, which is that of that emptiness, which never was an empty space. We have this vision of something homogeneous, a space which is homogeneous, and it never was that. And sometimes we have our ideas, and that depends whether you're leaning right or left, etc. So, if I may add something else about my Amazon, the one I know best, this is the Amazon that really suffered greatly from the recent trends of road building, the plans for building more railways for grain, and that has been debated about the waterways and the hydroelectric, like the Tapajós Telespires complex, etc. This is the Amazon, which is the transition from the Cerrado to the Amazon forest. Another important thing is that this is not perceived, that when we talk about the Amazon, we have to say what you're talking about, Cerrado or the forest. And these transitions, I think, are more and more important and complicated, because from Cerrado, which oftentimes we don't even see it as an important space, as an important biome, which was turned by agribusiness, and agribusiness through its interests affects more and more the Amazon. Since we don't have much time, I will stop here. I would like to get back briefly to a sentence about my beginning when I mentioned the river, from the river to the road. And I think in a way you could tell the story of the Amazon, and you could regionalize the Amazon based on the implementation of infrastructures. It is the infrastructure that initiates processes, conflicts, attacks, problems, in many situations. So with the road building, currently Porto Velho Manaus, which is very complicated, the problems in the region start to deepen more and more. I don't know if this is too structured. I hope you can understand a little bit of my thinking. We can go into it later. Thank you.
Very much, Martin, for your quick overview about the long history. And we will see later on that there's lots of articles in the atlas that speak about the roads, that speak about this mega projects you just mentioned. So there's more to read afterwards. And I will now ask Imme Scholz. Imme, you also co-wrote the introduction to the atlas, also the Brazilian version with Julia Dolce and Regina Schönberg and Marcelo Montenegro, our colleagues from Rio. And we actually, we invited Imme here tonight, this afternoon, sorry, because we want to shed some light on Germany's political interests and projections for the Amazon. And as Heinrich-Böll Foundation, we accompany more or less close the German-Brazilian cooperation on the Amazon, and both in the bilateral context, but also in multilateral institutions. And I would like to ask Imme, how would you describe the prevailing perceptions of the Amazon in these cooperations? Have you observed any shifts in the cooperation, or is there something very important missing to your mind?
Well, if I look at cooperation between Germany and Brazil, and I speak English because I was asked to, as I'm not a native speaker. E meu sotaque também existe. So from that perspective, actually, Germany's cooperation, bilateral cooperation with Brazil, has focused more and more and more over the decades on the Amazon, and it has withdrawn, like, let's say, from the northeast of Brazil or from the south. Yeah. So and when I went to Brazil, I also went to the Amazon, and my part of the Amazon was Pará, so I shared that with Aiala and Julia. Because I was working in the pilot program for the protection of the Brazilian tropical forests, and that was focusing mostly on, from the German side, on Pará, on the Amazonas and Acre, and also on the Atlantic rainforest, but mostly on the Amazon. And that was a political decision, and it was a decision based also on previous very long also public debates which had happened in Germany on the threats for climate and biodiversity associated with deforestation in the Amazon. And there was a large awareness of that this was not only a local or a regional danger, but a global one. There was a commission of the German parliament, you will remember that one, which focused on the dangers associated with deforestation, and it had a very strong focus on the Amazon region. And at that time it was very important because Amazonian peoples and researchers were looking for international support and international attention, because it was in the time when there was the transition from military dictatorship to democratic government. And at that time, the NGOs in Brazil, when there was dangerous legislation or dangerous political processes happening, often looked for public support abroad. So large solidarity networks were created to support resistance in Brazil against negative legislation and negative public investment infrastructure projects also. But when I was there in the 90s, we could see a big shift, because the protests of Brazilians were so effective and so large that international support was not needed anymore. And that was very important because it was also organized by Amazonian people. And I think that was a very important change in Brazil. It also had to do, obviously, with the advance of democracy and the strengthening of democratic rule, despite all the other problems which are still existing, unclear land rights, violence, weak judicial systems sometimes. But there was this strong ownership. Brazilians said, we are taking this in our own hands. And Amazonians said, we take this in our own hands. And when I went there with this, you mentioned the bilateral cooperation, the idea where I was working was to strengthen the environmental administration and in the Amazon and the Ministerio Público in the Amazon also to take over control. And we had, I always felt as being on the side of Pará, of the people in Pará, and sort of trying to make the state strong in relation to the central power. Yeah? Because of all the history of destruction of this destructive infrastructure development in the Amazon was very much linked to the central state plans for the Amazon, and it was like a colonization also. Because the point of departure was not the need of the Amazon, it was the need of the South, for example. Yeah. So, or the idea of establishing export-oriented mining projects or agriculture, which all started in, as you said, in the military dictatorship. So, in that sense, what started with the PPG7 and so this large program to protect the Amazon and to find to support new avenues of local development was an important phase. Now, I think if you ask about German imaginaries, I think I agree with you. I think that still, I think not you, because you are probably very interested in the Amazon and in Brazil, but if you ask Germans, I don't think that most of the Germans have an understanding of how large the Amazon is. It's several times Europe. I don't think they know that the majority of its peoples live in cities, and in cities of various sizes. And I don't think that there is an understanding that there are ways of land use that are not destructive. So that there is a peasant economy, a family-based economy which can work. That there are local experiences with a family agriculture that use the diversity, the environmental diversity, for being productive. So this diversity of peoples, of indigenous peoples, of traditional peoples, which is the result of its history, I don't think is sufficiently known, and the urban reality, which is also very important for organizing resistance and alternatives. And for producing the knowledge which the region needs for defining its own development ways. So I think that this is something which the Atlas can really tell us very well. One thing which I think is important is that the big blow German-Brazilian cooperation took in the years of Bolsonaro's presidency, when much of the cooperation had to be frozen, so to avoid that it's going to be misused by the government. And I think that the threat of some kind of Bolsonaro government returning exists. Yeah. And what we also see in the parliament is a very strong presence of his followers. And President Lula doesn't have a majority he can count on in the parliament. And I think that this is very worrying. And many of the problems associated with the advance of the extreme right is an area where Germans and Brazilians can have a lot to talk about because it's similar, and we also know that the extreme right from Germany is very well connected with the Brazilian side. And one example I would just like to mention, which also is a matter of should be a matter of dialogue and cooperation and solidarity for resistance, is the recently adopted bill on which changes the processes of environmental licensing and which makes it much less transparent. It makes it flexible to political judgment. If a project is strategic, then you don't have to do environmental licensing, and in this, especially in the Amazon region, could increase deforestation drastically and could bring the Amazon closer to the point where irreversible loss of the forest cover is triggered, because environmental scientists say it is when 20 to 25% of the Amazon forest cover are destroyed, then it could become an irreversible process. And now we are already at 18.2%. And if you imagine that this new environmental licensing regulation is fully applied, with all its flexibilizations, is fully applied to the Amazon, this could be very negative. But last evening, Aiala, we discussed that. Maybe you can show this thread, some light also on this danger which is ahead now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imme. And while you're talking, I'm already remembering all the articles I had to proofread with my colleagues. So please read afterwards more about the role of the military regime on the Amazon and the urban dimension of Amazonia and the diversity dimension, like quilombolas and other traditional communities. There's lots of interesting data. And now we're going closer and closer to the other Amazonias. And I would like to ask Julia. It was, maybe I should mention first, Julia, that I find it truly remarkable in that you have a very high awareness of the diverse perspectives of on the Amazon within Brazil, so how Brazilians from other regions look on the Amazon. And some of these visions or perceptions are quite shaped by ignorance or by prejudice, even racism, we have to say. And you always consistently emphasize the importance of centering the voices of and the decisions of the Amazonian people. That's something I realized while working with you, and especially in this Atlas projects. And I have two questions for you. The one is more on the Brazilian perspectives, and the other one will be about the curation of the Atlas. And for the second question, you also prepared a short presentation that you will see in a minute. But my first question is, how would you say do Brazilians from other regions typically look on the Amazon? Just to have an idea.
Eu acho que as duas respostas elas se completam.
I think both answers complement each other. I think facing this challenge of editing the Atlas, it was very difficult. It's a difficult thing for somebody from São Paulo. I lived very little time in Pará, and it's a German foundation with an office in Rio. So the idea of an atlas, I think Marcella Vecchioni, who was part of the editorial board, I think the very structure of an atlas, what does that mean? Originally, an atlas geographically is a very colonial figure, and the format of an atlas is very much inside the box. Originally, there is facts and data. It's all very mathematical, very graphical, and it's everything that, in fact, when we think about valuing other models of knowledge, other epistemologies and cosmologies, it seems that both things won't fit. But the other issue is also that the Amazon is not a theme. There's so many, as we've mentioned. Martin lived one, Imme and Aiala. It's different Amazons. Aiala has lived his whole life in there. So it's different from an atlas of agrochemicals, which is very centered and focused, and people are interested because it's a not very well-known theme. You have a target audience. So to me, it was hard to understand the meaning and how to turn this project into something that wasn't problematic with all the subtleties. At the same time, when you think about the image that the rest of Brazil has and the rest of the world has of the Amazon, a very reductive and reductionist image, it made sense to do this, to promote this X-ray, which is always going to be reductionist. It's impossible to encompass all the peoples and all the cosmologies, and it helps just to complexify the image we have, because the rest of Brazil is so foreign to the people of the Amazon as the Europeans. So I can come to indigenous land and be so foreign and white and Western as a German person there. So in that sense, I think to have somebody from the Amazon writing about these themes that they understand and the knowledge that they specialize in, I think that was quite a challenge, which I decided to take on because I understood that it would make sense to do it. And going into the side of the researcher, I just got my master's. I looked into the rural lobbying in the Congress and more into the anthropological point of view, how they think about the strategies about the indigenous lands to destroy legislation, how the indigenous land is structured in Brazil. And I try to update the concept of the demographic void, which Martin brought up. And I think it's very important to think about the Amazon. And if you think about empty pockets, voids is the basis that several colonial regimes have done around the world. In the Amazon, it was very important during the military dictatorship. We have the Medici administration saying that the Amazon would be a land without men, for men without land, which is basically Zionist. I think it's important to say right now about Palestine. I think it's also a slogan that was used in other contexts, in other territories around the world. And it was used also to colonize. So the idea that there's nobody there, and talking about the fact that people in Europe don't know that it's 28 million people living there, and many people live in cities, and many people live in their territories. I think this demographic void continues as an image that the rest of Brazil has of the Amazon. As weird as it may sound, a country doesn't know its own territory, and that's what happens. And I try to update how the ruralist caucus or bench or group in the Congress, it's unsustainable to say that there's nobody there. For more specialized people, more lay to the situation, it's hard to say, but they try to empty these territories of their meaning. So I do a survey of it's too much land for very few Indians. It's a very known sentence quoted by the predatory sectors since the Constitution established the rights of the original peoples. I think it's a sentence that really, when I did the mapping with the demarcation of the Xingu National Park before any kind of rights, any kind of indigenous rights in Brazil, and the idea of thinking about large territories for a small demographics, which is not as large as the urban areas, and the emptying meaning that this has is very important for agribusiness. And as a counterpoint, what they propose is big monoculture for export, And to that, they attribute a meaning because there is an economic meaning in that. So I try to work these ideas of the new voids which are created, bringing a little bit of that here, because what we have of the Amazon for the world is this emptiness, this void. It's a void of meaning, a void of understanding, and the multi-species relations, not just humans, but the enchanted of the Amazon and the beings which are not human beings, and that makes sense there, which in fact, more and more with the environmental collapse, we understand that these cosmologies and thinking about these territories with these interactions is the only way to fight climate collapse. So I think that the meaning of the atlas grew to me as I understood that for the foreigners, it could be very rich material, and also inviting the authors, which is something we can go into the second part of my response and go into the presentation, understanding that un minuto.
We can have the presentation now. And Aiala, was I see?
Entendendo que você reúne
To understand that collecting a body of authors from different parts of the Amazon, different ages, different peoples, we have given priority to authors from traditional peoples and communities, indigenous, quilombola, riverines, and that was something recent within Brazil, even valuing knowledge of these peoples. It's a counter-colonial thinking, which is conquering the world very slowly and very recently. So I have a short presentation explaining the idea of the atlas. It's in English. I will speak in Portuguese.
Calma aí. Ai, como volta? Pronto. Aqui são só alguns
Here we have just some examples of atlas that were produced in Brazil.
como a Júlia tinha explicado.
As Julia had explained, these were originally produced by the foundation here in Germany at the headquarters, and they were adapted with some Brazilian articles and translated to Portuguese. So the Amazon Atlas was the first one produced from the Rio de Janeiro office, produced from an office from the Global South. The idea,
A gente teve, né, o Marcelo principalmente
Marcelo especially,
cunhou essa ideia de fazer
when he created the idea of this atlas, was to collaborate
para acabar com os estereótipos.
to
Não acabar, mas desconstruir.
end the stereotypes, maybe not end, but to deconstruct them and add some complexity to the image that so many Brazilians, as well as the foreigners, have of the Amazon region. And we wanted to strengthen this production of knowledge by publicizing specialists from the Amazon and focusing on the centrality of local organizations this year, where the COP will be in Brazil. Very important, we got into many movements, in touch with many, some movements
Uma publicação que fizesse
to promote a publication that would make sense for the agendas, the political agendas of the different social movements.
E por último, né,
And finally, as every atlas, I think the idea is that this is a tool for training and advocacy by amplifying the voices that are fighting in this specific case to ensure territorial rights of traditional peoples and communities which are facing threats by the conflicts in the region. For that,
voltando para as delicadezas,
getting back to the subtleties of me being from São Paulo, the office is in Rio, and we're talking about the Amazon, we understood that we had to invite a body for an editorial board that would help us and has helped us throughout the process, from the establishment of the themes to how to summarize all this information, because this could go on forever. There could be 1 million chapters, but how could we just focus on an adequate size by thinking about the themes, the authors, who would be interesting authors from different states in the Amazon. And here we have the names. Aiala was one of the members of the editorial board. Angela Mendes, João Paulo Lima Barreto, Tucano, José Benatti, Karina Penha, Kátia Brasil, Elise Fairia, and Marcela Vecchione. These are people who are Amazonian, or they have worked in the Amazon for a long time in the academy with activism and journalism, etc. So these are specialists in several areas. The result of the atlas is 32 articles. In English, there's 33, one written by Martin and Flavia, and we ended up adding an extra article that was added to the online version by Connectivity and Internet in the Amazon, which with Starlink is an important discussion, which didn't go into the original atlas. We had over 60 authors, many authors in partnership, and some by indigenous collectives, which is a very interesting process when you think about facing European science and the model of European science and the academy, which is very competitive and very productivist. We include research groups and collectives that wrote and signed in co-authorship. That was very interesting to the process. We have these 60 authors. We have at least 15 peoples represented, indigenous peoples. I think it was 20 indigenous authors, some Quilombola authors from 2 communities. We also have some riverine authors from riverside communities, and the texts also are, they have graphs. We had 80 infographics, and in the beginning you're going to see there is this, the 15 facts, etc. And we have a glossary, which is very important for the English version with so many words and expressions which are hard to translate. I have an example here is the Aiala and Regina article. They wrote jointly about criminal factions. So you have seen the atlas, so you know what it's about. And here, just to give an idea of the themes, of the diversity of themes that were discussed here, we have divided it into 3 axes. The first, the idea was to show life more contextually, talking about geographical, biological, and social themes. The second axis is threats, more conjunctural, in terms of the sectors and interests which are predatory in the Amazon and their impact. And the third axis is futures, trying to point to some possible paths. It's more an epistemological questions written by people that question the very ideas to face environmental collapse, which are proposed by the West and by capitalism, and as a counterpoint to offer the local epistemologies as ancestral epistemologies that have to be looked at and valued to be able to keep the forest standing. And here we have an extra article by Martin, which was not in the original presentation, translating worlds, so to speak. Well, the PDF you can find for download on the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung website. There's also the printed version in Portuguese. We've already printed 2,000 copies. We've distributed in Brazil, in the Amazon. We've had some examples of training. We have one indigenous author from the Xingu region in Altamira who did a training in schools with the atlas. So they are going around, going to several territories, some still on the way. The idea is that they have local value for training, and we will have a printed version in English, which isn't ready yet, but will be ready soon. We had 2 events, 2 launch events, one in Belém on the 23rd of April, and in Rio, May 5th. More than 200 guests, and they had a large representation of organizations, collectives, and urban and rural movements, indigenous leaders, think tanks, and members of the Academy. Here's the event, the launching in Belém. And also, we had 66 press clippings mentioning the atlas. Here we have some pictures. We have Regina, who heads the office in Rio, doing an interview in TV Cultura in Pará, and Marcelo also CBN, Amazon. So we managed to have this focus by the media, which was very important to publicize the atlas. That's it.
Thank you very much, Julia. There's lots of Julias today, and I'm not sure if... Thank you very much for taking us into this project and telling us more about the way it was built. And Aiala, thank you very much for for waiting until we arrive now at Belém. And I have asked you before, I had one question prepared, and I asked him if it's okay if he answers this question, Aiala, because you are an expert on organized crime, specifically on drug trafficking, and you also wrote a book that was nominated for the Scientific Jabuti Award, which is, I think, good to mention here because it's very impressive. And in the next minutes, I would like to find out why this is a topic, the organized crime, that could not be left out of the atlas. As Julia said, your article that you wrote with Regina is part of the second part, the risk section. And my first question would be from the perspective of a key figure, not your perspective, but imagine being, how would a key figure in drug trafficking describe Amazonia? What is their Amazonia? What's their view of Amazonia for the work they do, or the business, the illegal business? Agora não.
Bem, boa tarde.
Good afternoon to everybody. It's a great honor to be here with you today on this beautiful afternoon. I'm sorry I don't speak English. I'm a rebel. I refuse to learn, but I'm forced to learn. I have to learn German too, English and German. Well, this first question is important because I will speak not only as an Amazonid, but as a quilombola. I come from a quilombola territory, which is part of this complexity that is the Amazon, as Martin mentioned. And it is hard not to mention themes which are directly linked to the most important forms of violations of rights, because as capitalism encroaches upon the region, other forms of violation also encroach upon the region. In the past, we used to talk about questions of land use, land grabbing, using farmers, traditional populations, indigenous, and river dwellers, quilombolas, against mining companies, farmers, and land grabbers, which are those that grab land unduly, public land that is grabbed. And now we're talking about the Comando Vermelho. These are crime factions. Comando Vermelho originally from Rio, Primeiro Comando da Capital, originally from São Paulo, and the crime organizations that act here. And we can talk about Ndrangheta, Italian, and also from Ireland, involving a dynamic which is not just drug trafficking. They understand the Amazon as a main corridor for supplying Europe and Africa with cocaine, but also illegal mining, gold extracted illegally. Not the gold that goes into Europe from Africa, but the gold that comes into Europe from Brazil. And on top of gold, other minerals like manganese, cassiterite that go directly to Belgium, and also smuggled wood. So this overlapping of activities of illegal nature, which encroach upon the territories and circulate and flow no problem in the region, I can see, and that's my vision, I see as one of the main problems that the Brazilian state has to face. Because we're not talking about a problem which has been happening for 2 or 3 years, but it has been happening for many, many years, since the notion of integration, of the appropriation of the territory like was done during the military regimes. But this has become more and more complex, and we have to make previous governments responsible that were absolutely not careful, and the Bolsonaro administration did that really well, delegitimized the environmental agenda. There was a sort of working of the state that should be protecting the populations and the forest, and this complexity got to this point because the criminal factions and their groups, they have understood that they could also start with this institutional frailty to start smuggling wood, also illegal mining, and cassiterite and manganese, and also the appropriation of public lands for commercial purposes. This is what the government faced today. And I, as a quilombola, and I see the quilombola territory with 64 families, and next to my territory, there's another community with 56 families, and on the other side, there is one with 46 families. We have a whole difficulty of getting there. It's kilometers of roads without any kind of paved roads, any kind of security. So these are families that they work slowly. They live in a slow time. A relationship with nature, which is, during lunchtime, we go to the river, we go swimming in the river. Or I don't have to go to the supermarket to buy water. I go in my backyard, which is an extension of where you live, and you get what you have in terms of fruit, for example, you consume. That's a slow time, slow living. A morning lasts almost the equivalent of a whole day here. You sleep, you wake up, you sleep, and then the morning is still going. When I want to write something, I go to a quilombola territory because I have more time. And these communities are facing this problem with criminal factions that are inside the territories threatening the community leaders, which is happening today, and at the same time co-opting, especially the youth, to be part of that. And I'm talking about the river dwellers, quilombola, indigenous youth, which has now increased the number of indigenous peoples that are in jail. Why? Because they have a relationship with drug trafficking.
Thank you, Aiala. I will I will ask you some more questions on this, because I think in the article Aiala has written, you will find also more information about the transnational connections, like with the other countries of Latin America, and also mentioning Europe already. And I'm very happy that tomorrow, after this official event, we also have some appointments with politicians and the Ministry for the International Cooperation, where we will mention this reality, because they, to our mind, this new reality that you described, Aiala, is also important for international cooperation, of course. If we put money into projects for the protection of the forest, this must be part of the analysis. And I'm sure the ministry is aware of this, but we will bring some more and close information on that. And I know the organized crime is it's a very hard topic, it's very complex, and maybe you could quickly, because in the atlas there's an interesting map, mapping the routes by air, by the rivers, by the roads, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how this work is done, how you get the data, and maybe just quickly, not to go into more details, but maybe to let us know how you research on this topic, because maybe not everyone is familiar with the way you work on the topic.
Eu acredito que todo trabalho que envolve tema polêmico.
I believe every work that involves a polemic theme has to have a strategy. If you talk about the militia in Rio, you have to be careful. The same with drug trafficking. And today, the main money laundering schemes in drug trafficking involve the evangelical churches, with all due respect. I do not in any way want to create a negative image of the church, but the evangelical churches, the real estate sector, which does a lot, and also the notary publics in the Amazon, which is the place where you go and legitimize a certain land use and documentation. So notary public, churches, and also real estate. That's how you do money laundering in the Amazon. And when we talk about a methodology which is investigative and talking about this theme, we have to have a strategy of insertion. For example, when we try to discover how does the drug trafficking go into illegal mining, I had two strategies. One is going to Roraima, the state that borders Venezuela and has a transnational action of illegal mining and drug trafficking, because from Brazil, they go from Brazil to Venezuela to work in mining in Venezuela, and Venezuelans come to Brazil to work in illegal mining in Yanomami in Roraima, Yanomami land. So this trans-border relationship that involves these two territories, we have two factions. On the Venezuelan side, we have Tren de Aragua, which the U.S. tried to frame as a terrorist group. I don't know if they managed. And on the other side, Primeiro Comando da Capital, which was the first criminal group that entered indigenous territory and started to articulate the control strategies of illegal mining, which expanded to other territories. So the first issue is to try to define what are the strategic points we have to go to understand, to do the so-called systematic observations. First, you observe where the problem is happening. And you have to be very careful, because when I went to Jacaracanga, Itaiatuba, which are two municipalities in the state of Pará, and that are facing problems with mining, my arrival in the city already, and I am black, I'm not white. Imagine a white person getting there. It showed that I was a foreigner. So immediately, my picture was already in the WhatsApp group of the miners. But since we have some work through the university that I work in these places, so they explained that I was a professor and I was doing activities of teaching in the place. That was a form of shielding myself. After that, I was in touch with the people I was working with to be able to get to the mining. So I went to the mining sites. I couldn't take any pictures as I should have done because there is a whole control. And I was for about 2 weeks in the cities talking to many people. And there I saw that the size of the damage is huge, because a cook in a mining site, she can make 40,000 reais a month just cooking in a mining site. 40,000 reais, that's a lot of money. It's all about gold. There's no money, there's gold. There's no money circulating. So illegal gold, it's a whole chain that goes from the cook that may be earning 40,000 reais a month, depending on the market price, but also human trafficking, slave work, through debt. For example, if you go into debt, there's no way you ever leave. And especially sexual exploitation. There's a whole network of women that are vulnerable, that come from many places in Brazil, and they go to the mining sites. So the mining, illegal mining shows that. And drug trafficking is different. Why? Because you have two core issues. The first, you have a macro trafficking, which is much more organized, and that involves articulations in Europe, but also at the border and the Brazilian territory. And these are corporate groups of the drug trafficking that don't show in the main media. And then the more territorialized groups, you have the big network, which feeds the whole financial network, and that also gets in touch with this organizational structure. And then you have a production which is more per zone. And these are smaller groups that encroach on the territory. And this small group is where I started to have access by identifying where you have a certain area that is then territorialized by the trafficking. I'm writing a book about the history of the Comando Vermelho in Belém, how Comando Vermelho in Belém appropriates structures which were consolidated, but they create a second organizational structure with which the criminality goes down, because it reduces theft, it reduces robbery, and they start to be hegemonic in the territory. I'm studying this now. And these are the strategies, but we have to be careful. I did the surveying of the places that you look at the routes. There's a city in Pará called Jabaitetuba, which is known as the Medellin of the Amazon. To give you an idea, the week before last, a radio journalist was killed during his show. It was a radio journalist that was denouncing drug trafficking at the port, because in the Amazon, the rivers are much more used than the roads. It's safer to go through the river, although it's more work. So he had denounced the port, and he said about the cocaine that was going to be, and it was seized. 2 weeks later, he was killed live on his show. That was a message to any kind of show that tries to dare to talk about Comando Vermelho in the municipality. And 1 week before, I was in the municipality doing the same work about the Comando Vermelho. So there's many strategies. People say, oh, have you been threatened? Because I have a lot of articles that talk about the Comando Vermelho on top of the book you mentioned. I was never threatened, and I'd rather not be. And once I asked for help, some time ago, because a friend of mine was robbed, and I told another friend about this robbing, and he knew somebody who was connected to the crime faction. The next day, they returned everything that had been stolen. So these are the peripheral communities in several cities in the Amazon that are coming closer to the factions to ask for some kind of support, something that the state does not provide. And that drug trafficking has been giving the support, prohibiting violence against women. There is a neighborhood, Bairro do Barreiro in Belém. It was the first neighborhood that said there's the crime tribunal. What is that? There is no robbery in the community, and then no violence against women. So it's not the police or the state, but it was the drug trafficking that imposed that rule, and that becomes a rule, and that gains approval, which is controlling services. Internet, for example, is controlled by drug trafficking in Belém. Drinking water, gas, private security, etc. And in the rural areas, which is just closing this part, which is very problematic, there's a relationship between the farmers, large-scale farmers, with the factions. So, for example, charcoal makers. There's some charcoal factories that pollute the rivers, the igarapés of the region, and promote logging, and they have a pact with the Comando Vermelho faction. And we use, in slang, in Belém, we say, they are gifted, they are shielded. It's a kind of protection. One of the people that were threatened, they asked for help. How can I get some help? Well, you cannot think of help right now, because if you've been threatened that you shouldn't talk to the people in the charcoal factory, you got the message. You can't do it. And this is now in all municipalities in the Amazon, including those at the border, which are routes for drug trafficking, cities that are strategic places where the drug flows. And to close, to give you an idea, we have today in Pará 56 quilombola communities with the presence of the Comando Vermelho, and some communities which traditionally in the quilombos you have the saints celebrations. These are hundreds of years old. The faction has taken over the festivity. It was a community festivity, and the money would go to the association of people that live there. Today, the festivities, of the saint festivities, it doesn't go to the inhabitants. They go to the Torre da Facção, which is the head of the faction that controls that area. It's a kind of boss. You have the general that coordinates the whole area. Then you have the tower who coordinates the territory. And after that, you have different hierarchies of relationship.
Very, very impressive and very scary at the same time. And thank you very much for giving us some more insights into the reality of how the fractions are organized and how they organize the territories, and yeah, be careful, of course, and just making this reference that the risk the risks that people face researching on these illegal activities, also people who defend human rights, environmental rights. I think this is a topic that we talk somehow here in Germany. There's also an article on this topic, on the violence against environmental defenders. For example, the case of Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira that were assassinated 3 years ago in connection with illegal fishing activities in another region of the Amazon. But yeah, just to yeah, it's a very hard reality that you described, and I'm happy that, as I understood, Aiala, you work also as a senior researcher for the Brazilian Forum for Public Security, which is an NGO, but working together with state institutions, also civil and military police officers. So that's also an important area where you can put your knowledge into. But coming to my next question, I would like to go back a little to the Institute Crioula, where you are the director. And this institute is an organization dedicated to defending Amazonian communities through culture, education, and science. And as you just mentioned, your Quilombola origin, your heritage, powerfully embodies the diversity of the people we see in the Amazon. And I would like to ask you, going a little bit back, what Julia said about the perception of the Brazilians not living in the Amazon, of the Amazon. Do you want to add something, maybe as a citizen of Belém, because there's a lot of talking now in the national media about Belém, if the city is capable of hosting the COP30. What do you see? What are they saying about your Amazonia? Something you would like to explain to us?
Boa essa pergunta.
That's a good question.
Quando a gente olha hoje,
When you look at the Amazon today, you understand that there is a geopolitical, Berta Becker, a geographer from Rio, in 2003 published Geopolitics of the Amazon at the turn of the third millennium. And
20 anos atrás, ela já traz
some 20 years ago, she was bringing the thesis that
naquele contexto
in that context, the Amazon region was already an important region of global geopolitics based on three elements: the issue of the market, the life market, which is mega biodiversity, how this is important to the world today; the issue of the air market, which has been incorporated to REDD+, etc., the carbon market,
se dá hoje sobre as comunidades quilombolas.
which today is talked about in the Quilombola communities. Some have signed agreements without reading the document, and they've given the right for the exploitation 20, 30 years of the carbon surplus. And the state of Pará tries to organize it, but also to appropriate for it. So nothing is left for the communities and indigenous communities which went through that. And also hydropolitics, drinking water. So we've had this discussion since the military government, and then the climate crisis, which today is announced as an idea of trying to, in the Amazon, find the solutions for the so-called climate crisis. So to me, it doesn't make any sense to talk about climate crisis and not host an event in the Amazon region. But the problem I see, I've been in 2 climate conferences in Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh and in Dubai. We also had problems with accommodation because Cairo is more touristic, but Sharm el-Sheikh is not so touristic, but they managed to organize the event. And in Belém, there's something important. If I'm in the Amazon talking about climate security, the environmental issue, I have to live the Amazon, which is something that, of course, our government hasn't understood. Our governor trying to build some modern things. You know, people that leave Germany, France, England, Europe in general, are very used to having skyscrapers and buildings and artificial constructions, but not so used to that, which in fact represents nature. So to go to the Amazon, you have to see and meet the Amazon. I think the investment that was made to ensure the event was a very mistaken one, because it created some internal contradictions, like the valuing of real estate is very high to rent or buy, and it has included the people that should have been included. It has included a small political elite of the state, which are the people that have relations with the restaurants and services in general that want to work with this demand. But I see that it's possible to have this COP and host it, but there's a conflict of the Southeast and the North. Why? Because Rio de Janeiro tried to bring it to Rio, saying that they had accommodations for everybody that came to the event. São Paulo started to question. The journalists, ignorant of the Southeast, with all due respect to the journalists from the Southeast, not all of them, just 90%, they started to reproduce prejudiced and xenophobic narratives, saying ignorant things. I'm sorry to say that, but a journalist from São Paulo said 2 weeks ago that in Belém, literally, we lived on top of shit. She said shit. That's what she said, because she went to Belém to show basic sanitation problems. But in São Paulo, there's also a huge amount of basic sanitation. In Rio, they've never really solved the problems of the communities, the favelas, but they took data from the IBGE and said that Belém was full of favelas. It is, in fact, but they forgot to define favela according to the IBGE, because in the past, it was associated to poverty and precariousness, and then the IBGE decided to make it more complicated. They said subnormal dwellings. It didn't work, and they went back to favelas. But now the idea of favela talks about baixada. In the case of Belém, there's a lot of lowlands in Belém, and the idea of quebrada, ghetto, and a more cultural aspect. Given this ignorance of understanding the idea of favela, they got these data to say that it was a problem in Brazil. How do we host an event like COP? So I know that it's very important to have this event in Brazil. We are preparing several demonstrations. It's going to be 2 COPs. One legitimated by the state, by the Brazilian government, but we're also going to do the COP of the people. And the COP of the people is a revolutionary act that is contrary to lots of things discussed at the COP, which became a business to sell green services. So it's the old idea that when capitalism has a crisis, it creates a strategy to survive. If the crisis is climate, let's sell cars, electric cars. Let's invest in something that's sustainable from the point of view of the market to ensure the survival of capitalism. So, and the Mãe Crioula Institute, the NGO I'm part of, is an institution that's homage to my grandmother, who was called Arlinda Colares. She was benzedeira, and benzedeira, she was a healer. It's these women that have this gift of being healers, and they also cure. Not all work, She was also a midwife. My grandmother had this gift. They wanted to put their tummy in place. That's a woman that's going to have a baby through a C-section, and they don't want it. So my grandmother would place the kid in the right position to have a natural birth. And it's incredible, because not only placing the baby in the right place, she would guess the gender of the child. She never got it wrong. And she was very looked for because of that. So when the child was born, they would bring it to my grandmother so that she would heal them, so that the child wouldn't get sick. So all this knowledge that my grandmother had, she was a big leader. That's what she was called, mother. She had more than 400 kids that called her mother. So my grandmother left, and I don't want to let this finish. I want an institute that's homage to her, because in the Amazon we face these problems, which is the advancement of modernity. Because modernity comes breaking things, the relation to the earth. To this day, if I come in the afternoon in a river, Igarapé, I ask for permission because I grew like that. If I go into the forest alone, I ask for permission because I've been lost when I was a child. I was lost in the woods because my cousin and I went into the woods without asking for permission. If you go in, don't ask for permission, you may get lost. And we were rescued. So I know what that is. I believe. Even if I don't live in a quilombo, and if I go there once in a while, I go a lot, I still believe in that. So the idea of the institute that we created is to try and strengthen this discussion, because I will take a sentence from Ailton Krenak, said, the future is ancestral. Modernity hasn't presented a solution yet. And in my community, I still consume pesticide-free products which are cultivated in my backyard. I have everything. That's the way. But what's the problem? That we face all these contradictions of the advancement of large properties, crime factions, and the pressure that agribusiness exerts on government, on Congress. The pressure, it's a very strong political lobby by the agribusiness. There is an inequality in terms of investment. More is invested in agribusiness, less in family agriculture. The result is what you see today. The advancing of soybean and other products, the reduction of that which serves the local market, inflation goes up, you create food insecurity, and the conflict disseminates in a way that is irreversible sometimes. That is what happens sometimes in Brazil. We have to face this problem and tackle it. And I see, just in closing, the government is under much pressure. We see this polarizing. I don't believe in polarizing because the left was always on one side, but on the other side, you see the growth of the extreme right with ultra-conservative discourse, which today is a big threat to the protection of these traditional territories.
Thank you very much, Aiala. And I just realized that while you were talking, I like the reference to your grandmother, very nice. But we came back actually to the demands that we talked about in the beginning, the demands on the region, as you mentioned, the carbon credits. And yeah, I would like to finish this first part now and make a little shorter round. And as we already said several times today, the COP30 will be a very important event from the actually, next week, they will start the June climate meetings in Bonn, like the so-called SB62, like a pre-COP meeting here in Germany, and of course the COP in November. And as Julia Deutz explained also, we hope that this atlas serves as a gateway to regional knowledge, offering a valuable instrument for understanding the complexity that we've been talking about for the COP30, but of course beyond the COP30. And I would like to ask all four of you quickly that you pick or suggest or recommend one article from the Atlas that you think everyone should read before the COP, and explain quickly why. I don't know who wants to start. We can start with Martin. You want to start? You have a mic in your hand.
Bom, se eu deveria começar.
Well, if I'm to start, my suggestion would be not just read one, but read the whole thing. Because the articles are they're not very lengthy. You can read everything. And I think that we don't need to proliferate that notion that, oh, you can't read too much. No, read everything. Because by reading all of them, you're going to understand the diversity of that region where this COP will take place. Well, I'm not a specialist in COPs. I've never participated in one, but what I have seen in the news about COPs is that oftentimes they are in a sort of extraterritorial situation, like a UFO that landed. So I think that the opportunity of creating a bridge between those people, those delegations, many international delegations that will come to the Amazon, in order to understand where they are, what they can bring, but also leave behind for the Amazon in the sense of a dialogue. I think it's never about teaching somebody. It's a dialogue which makes itself necessary. And I really think I would like to congratulate you on this atlas because I think it is perfect exactly for creating these bridges, these dialogues on issues, and also understanding that even if we talk about the environment, you have to think about the fact that environmental justice has to be followed by social justice. And that connection, I think, is fundamental for understanding a universe which is so diverse as the Amazon. That's why the Atlas is perfect. Don't just read one, but all articles. Yeah, there's enough time.
So who wants to go next? Imme.
I also recommend to read it all, of course. But what I really liked was to read the articles on the archaeological findings. So how old structures of land use and social structures, archaeologists are now finding out about that, because for many, many, many decades, American anthropologists who came to the Amazon were convinced this is a tropical region. There couldn't have been a highly developed culture. And now the new findings show this is not true. And I think we can learn a lot from that. So this is these two articles there in the beginning are one of my favorites. But of course, we are living in the present. And I think the articles, I was just looking for the pages because I cannot remember the titles, but it's on page 50 and 52. It's about the economy of organized crime and the fate of those who resist, so civil society organizations, local organizations. And I think this is very important because we know that the type of societal change we need for really giving preservation of the Amazon a chance needs to be rooted in society, and we need civil society for that. And so it's not something just governments can agree and negotiate, but they need to create the conditions so that civil society takes an active role, is not threatened. I mean, it sounds like fantasy, like utopia now, after all what we have heard from you. But I think we have to keep that awake and to be clear that this is at stake. So without democracy and climate agenda and biodiversity agenda and local agendas are extremely linked. And therefore, it's always a political fight, and we have to make this very clear. And I think this is also part of the responsibility of Germany and European actors who are there. And let me just say this, I think we have a shared interest here. There is a close cooperation between Brazil and Germany. There are intergovernmental consultations, and I think it's important to look at the responsibility of this cooperation working for democracy and preservation of the Amazon and the planet.
Any more
Acho que dá para ler tudo também.
I think you should read everything, of course. Yeah. Well, I don't care. If you don't read, you're not going to read. But if you read, you can read these articles, which are short. I would highlight one, which I like especially. Authoritarian Subjectivities, written by Bruno Malheiro, a professor at the Federal University of South and Southeast Pará. And I like this article because it touches on, Bruno calls these cultural and religious aspects of what he calls the capitalist war in the Amazon. But I think that it has a lot to do with what I understand as ontological wars, which is how the agrarian frontier, the mineral frontier, the frontier of the predatory sectors, it destroys everything that is in place in cosmological, ontological terms, and the importance of religion for that, and the advancement of the neo-Pentecostal churches. Recently, we have an update of the data on religion in Brazil. I think it was 10 years in the making. And the evangelical church is not as strong as one thought it was. It was supposedly almost half the Brazilian population was evangelical, but it's not that much, but still, it's a very strong religion. And Aiala mentioned that you have churches and churches, and you have leaders and leaders, but with agribusiness, when it arrives aligned with neoliberalism, you have these aspects which are very recent of social networks and a culture which we call the theology of prosperity, prospering, and we have political leaders on the far right that are really surfing this wave. We have influencers, and we have the apps, the betting apps. It's really a modernity juice that comes destroying ontologies, and it's very dangerous because it reduces everything to a big pulp of monoculture, which, like soybean, they kill everything that's considered a pest, multi-species and multi-beings that they consider pests. And so two quick ones, Raquel Tupinambá on anthropogenic forests, which Aiala also mentioned. It suggests how much the indigenous ancestral presence has created the forest as it is today. It has been planted with a knowledge that is very sophisticated. It is a very sophisticated science, and I think this is a response to modernity. And the article by Anacleta Pires da Silva, who was a quilombola leader in Maranhão, very important, and she died right after writing the article. She was fighting cancer, and it's an article that is very beautiful and very touching, that proposes in a raw form this counterpoint to modernity, to this modern juice that destroys everything in its path. It's called Pulsating with the Heart of the Earth. It's one of the last of the Atlas. I recommend these three.
Julia, Aiala, you have a suggestion, which is a suggestion to the audience, which is not your article. Another one.
Eu já lhes leio o meu texto.
Well, you should read my text.
Assim, eu sou suspeito para falar.
Well, I'm in no position to say that because since I was revising, I agree with Martin. You have to read everything because if you're on the plane, you can read this really quickly. It's just a page and a half each. And we were very concerned about making it a page and a half. People sent in 4 pages. We're like, no, 1.5 pages. It's all very didactic. And the texts which you mentioned, Bruno and Anacleta, they're very interesting because these are texts that deal with an epistemology of nature. I think Anacleto is really like a poem. And Anacleta died right after. She was a great quilombola leader. It was very shocking for us from the quilombola movement to lose her, because when one of us goes,
Uma liderança muito forte dentro da comunidade.
especially if you're a strong leader in the community, that leaves a big void because we see the difficulty of replacing people given this modern juice, as you put it. We can try to have our youth connect via internet and create their WhatsApp and their Instagram page, but please don't give up the fight. And Bruno was my colleague in university, and we studied together. He talks a lot about epistemological discussions, and in the Amazon, we do what we call the denouncing geography, a geography of denouncing the issues of mining, illegal mining. These are texts which, in fact, they try to denounce this capitalist war. There is a capitalist war in the Amazon, and this is instituted after the Bolsonaro administration. Not that it started with him, but it's this whole notion of this civilizational process, not just based on land use, but also the racial issue. And here we're talking about quilombola, river dwellers, indigenous populations, and this relationship between race and territory marks the conflicts that involve the advancement of mining. And there is Vale, the company, and agribusiness. This is all very important to give an idea of what is the Amazon as resistance and as a problem.
Thank you very much. Now we've arrived. Unfortunately, we could continue talking, but we have to finish right now. And I would like to open up the space for questions, 2 or 3 questions from the audience. And there will be a microphone in a second, because we need you to speak into the mic in order to have the translation. Here in the first row.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Svenja, and I only want to ask a very fast question. It's nothing of content. It's just about that I cannot find the names of the authors under the articles or even in the summario.
Yeah, so I can explain rapidly, because in the Atlas format you find in the end the list of the authors. Okay. Yeah, you have there's a long list of each article, the authors, and the how you say that, the fonts, the sources of the graphs and the texts and so on.
Thank you. I did not find that before.
Yeah, this is something very specific of the Atlas format.
Okay. Próximo?
Yeah.
Bom, eu sou Simon, trabalho na Associação Living Gaia aqui em Berlim.
I'm Simon. I worked here with indigenous communities in Acre. We have a small association. I wanted to ask a question to Aiala, which you mentioned briefly, money laundering of evangelical churches, which are involved in the money laundering from these crime factions. I also looked into the advancement of evangelical churches in the Amazon, and I know that it's a whole complicated picture that you can't generalize, but I wanted to know a little more about the strategies. How do they do it? How are they involved with the factions?
Is there more questions? If not, we can go directly to Aiala. There's another question. And just reminding everyone, we're live streaming and we're also recording, so everyone who will use the microphone will also be heard in the live stream and the recording.
Olá, obrigada pelas falas de vocês.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentations. I wanted to ask a question to Aiala about the People's COP, as you mentioned, because we also follow these activities, these parallel activities to the official COP. And we talk a lot about the People's Summit, and we also heard from indigenous peoples that have been here about the People's COP. And I wanted to know if you can talk a little bit more about the preparation for the People's COPs and how much that is close or far from the summit of the people.
There's one more question in the row here, and then you can answer the...
Boa tarde, meu nome é Cláudia.
Hi, I'm Claudia from Guatemala, but life brought me to Brazil a little bit, to Acre. I have been working in the extractive reservation, Chico Mendes, and people who live there talk about education. In the extractive territories, indigenous territories, which doesn't really represent the reality of the children and the youth in the territory. So I wanted to ask, I think maybe to Julia, maybe how this theme of education within the forest, in the cities too, how did you write about this theme, which I think is very important, based on the themes of ontological and epistemological wars?
Aiala, you want to start? And then Julia, I think, might add something.
Bem, primeira pergunta sobre a questão.
Well, the first question is about churches.
Eu lembro de uma história
I remember a story.
de caso que teve uma rebelião no
There was an uprising in a jail in Belém. We had a jail that was inside of the city, and there were several rebellions, and the last one, they decided to shut it down, and it turned into a museum. I can't go in because I leave with a headache because it's so heavy, the energy there. But one scene, that was one of the inmates, when there was a conflict, he ran, and so as not to die, he threw himself from 12 to 13 meters height. He falls, breaks his hip, goes to the hospital, doesn't die, and is not quadriplegic. He spent 18 years in prison, got married in prison, became evangelical, left, and now he is a pastor, an evangelical pastor. He was one of the main drug traffickers in Belém. When I saw the story, I was curious. Oh, he became evangelical, he's a pastor, and he's still feared. People still respect him. And I tried to understand the relationship between evangelical church and the work in the prison system. I went there to see how it works. The evangelical church has a lot of work in the jails in Brazil. In several countries you have that. And there you have the strategy of turning into an evangelical drug dealer. In Rio de Janeiro, there is a faction. I think 3 weeks ago, one of the leaders of the Complexo de Israel was killed by the police. Yesterday, I was looking at the news that Linha Amarela in Rio is a road in Rio that was blocked because of conflict of Complexo de Israel with the police. And there was a shootout. And so it's easy to create a church. It's much easier to create an evangelical church because if you get the cities that are the drug trafficking routes, we did a comparison with the IBGE. Their route in the Amazon, there most of the population is evangelical. In Roraima, in Boa Vista, the capital, we went to a church that was created by a drug dealer that was connected to illegal mining too. So today, in this context, when you have the data of evangelicals in Brazil and you look at the north, the Amazon, and you take the cities which face problems with land problems and mining, and there are routes of drug trafficking, most of the population is evangelical, and there are people who have a relationship with illegal activities connected to the church, and these are the people that created the church. You have this direct relationship. So what do I see today? This is a problem in that some communities that the evangelical church reaches out to, they create a break. São Raimundo da Palestina in Santarém, where the community was broken up, and they couldn't work with soy because you had Catholics and Protestants, so you couldn't have a unity. So the families were reducing. A community that had over 1,000 families now has less than 300, and they're disappearing, like Genipabu, which had 1,000 families. Today it doesn't exist. So you see, that's a problem. This relationship is real, and that's how it works. So the money laundering by the church is much easier to be done. Therefore, we say narco-Pentecostal. That's what we call them. That was the first. About the People's COP, there are several meetings, several groups of civil society. The People's Summit in Belém in the year before last had a lot of protests. Because what happened was we have to be careful when some companies, they take on an image to be able to create a discourse which is protectionist, sustainable. I'm not going to mention any by name. Some of these companies, they appropriated the image of the indigenous peoples. So the People's Summit was marked by indigenous presence. And what was the problem of this debate? The problem is not having some indigenous people there. The problem is that they were shown as if there weren't any river dwellers, quilombolas, as if you didn't have farmers, small family farmers. And the debate was just about sustainable products, forestry service, the idea of a standing forest, generating resources supported by the government, and the indigenous communities as this territory that could have a dialogue with REDD Plus and the market, the carbon market. So there was a lot of protests by the Quilombola youth because they were excluded from the debates. Today we see that again. The fear of having protests and not having a direct dialogue with those that are fighting in the territory. That's why the People's Summit will be this parallel event to the COP. Where's it going to happen? In several points in the city, Federal University of Pará, other campi from public and private universities, and also public squares. It's going to be all over. We're talking about all social organizations in Belém, the state of Pará, and also the ones that are outside, the Black Initiative of Rio, Educaf, etc. So there's a network to occupy these spaces. It's good to be in touch with somebody who's articulating so that you can strengthen the debate. About education, what's the problem? We talk a lot about that. There is no way. Have you heard about Nego Bispo? Have you heard about Nego Bispo? Nego Bispo was an intellectual, semi-illiterate of a quilombo, whose production is incredible compared to any intellectual of any university. There was an intellectual spirit that he incorporated to write. He would just dictate. He couldn't write with just his ideas. So one of his ideas that I think is fantastic, he says, if everything I learned, I can pass to those that come after me, and so on and so forth. Even if I die, I will be alive. But that which I learned, which I pass on to somebody that came after me, and those don't pass it on, even if I'm alive, I'll be dead. That's an idea. Because that's what you call ancestrality, which is that which my grandmother learned from her grandmother, and so on and so forth. And my mother and my aunts should have learned to pass it on, and they didn't learn. And they didn't care to learn. So that's what you lose, ancestrality. So where is education come into the picture? Because education in a quilombola territory or an extractive reservation, you have to consider that ancestral relationship. And that which is the school curriculum is something which is outside the territory. So you really have a reproduction of the colonial discourse, losing ancestrality. Today we have a lot of debate in Pará and other states in the Amazon about the quilombola education politics, to consider this in the curriculum and to respect that in the classroom and training teachers to work with that. The only way of keeping alive this memory, this history, and this narrative, and this ancestrality. There is a huge difficulty in doing that. Why? because the production of didactic material is not based on the community. It's coming from the secretaries of education, the state secretaries, and oftentimes there is a political nomination. It's not somebody that knows the area. So we fight for that. Recently, we had one quilombola in the state of Pará, Secretary of Education, to advance the quilombola ideas. Oh, but he didn't go to college, etc. He's not a doctor. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if he doesn't have a doctor, a PhD. He's a quilombola down there fighting the fight. So he knows what's important to have to add in this curriculum and what's not. Let's talk about the relation of the community with the issue of the forest, extractivism, the river, the respect to the river's spirituality, the respect to nature, and also respecting ancestrality. I take my blessings. Taking your blessings is to respect the elderly, which today in the cities you don't see anymore. In some communities, it's still there. That's education for us. That's done in the village, in the quilombo, in the extractive reserve. And that has to be an educational practice and at the same time decolonizing to strengthen the movement for an education based on the territory. That's the main alternative, to face the hurdles based on the organization. We as a social government have to defend this agenda to make sure it is part of the political agenda of the state, of the union, the municipalities, etc.
Julia, you want to add something on the
É,
role
só
of the young people?
complementando. Cláudia, prazer te conhecer pessoalmente.
Nice to meet you in person. We don't have an article on education in the Atlas. I think that's missing. We did this critique after the publication. It's not the first time we have a question / requirement, which is important. We do have some infographics that touch on some data about this issue, especially indigenous point of view. We have a graph on page 64 on youth that talks about some numbers, some indigenous students enrolled in schools. We have to highlight here a large number of schools that work without their own buildings, which I think is something that has to be questioned because we cannot have the same metrics
Uma infraestrutura adequada.
as what is considered an adequate infrastructure. Oh, there isn't a building, so there isn't learning. That doesn't necessarily apply. But in general, the fight for education of traditional peoples with a different education, a quilombola education, indigenous education, is a historic struggle, which is made flexible by the government in Brazil. The rural schools, they're very threatened. You go to territories where you have some settlers. The rural schools, they are always a target for conflict. In Pará, in Anapu, which is one of the epicenters of agrarian conflict in Brazil, when I was there, I photographed a school that was, some farmers set fire to the school. That's very common. They target the school as a symbol of an education. It's against modernity because the indigenous and quilombola schools, they bring this different teaching. You know that indigenous teaching on top of the content, which is a normal curriculum of schools. You have some curricula, which is mother tongue and also knowledge. You have indigenous knowledge. I forget the name. What's the name? I forget. Anyway, it's these two disciplines that are included in the curriculum, and that's very threatening to some people when you have this invasion of modernity and a kind of religion which is intolerant and authoritarian, and capital which is authoritarian. It's a threat to have a school that promotes the recovery of ancestral knowledge and the convergence of the curriculum in Brazil. So there's another graph on page 27 about the indigenous presence in the universities, which between 2010 and 2022, from 9.8 thousand enrollments to 46.3 thousand enrollments of indigenous peoples, which is in sync with the impressive growth of self-proclaimed indigenous peoples in Brazil in the last census, which is a big threat for a project that tries to pose a demographic void. You have a doubling in the population that are self-proclaimed traditional peoples. That is seen as a big threat to modernity, to a whiteness which wants to impose itself as universal. And you have more and more people saying that they're quilombola, traditional people, and indigenous. And that is what agribusiness tries forcefully to fight. They try to assimilate these identities, these othernesses, and try to make them part of the same project, a white project of monoculture, which the schools are a symbol of this threat and resistance. That's why they're always a first structure that is attacked when you have agrarian conflicts. But in fact, there is a missing article on that, and maybe we can do it for the online version.
Thank you, Julia. One quick last comment from Martin, and then we have to close the event so we can,
Eu
have a
não
get
sei
together.
se tem que ser muito rápido.
It has to be very brief. I think I will open something new, but just to touch on, it's just food for thought. Well, we mentioned several times here that most of the people that live in the Amazon today live in cities. Large part of those that live in the Amazon today are migrants that came from other places. So my specialization in the Amazon is working on these pioneer fronts. So it's thousands of people who live in the region. The city where I worked a lot in the last year is called Sinop. You know what that means? Sinop? Sociedade Imobiliária do Noroeste do Pará, a real estate society in the north of Pará. So that's the name of the city, Sinop. It's an abbreviation. So back to education, this is a fundamental point of trying to strengthen an education, be it formal or informal, but that has the power to transform socio-environmentally, which is needed in the region. So, for example, out of those new Amazonians, in a way, let's say, what in the collective memory, where is the past, the indigenous past in the collective memory? Because it is a past, it's not a present anymore in many regions, but it has to be preserved. So I think that this is also a fundamental issue of thinking how you can, especially in the areas of agribusiness, how you can work with education. I have a hope. I have a lot of contacts with universities in those regions. There are some which are very specialized on the issue of agricultural economy, where there is a situation with a lot of students, etc., that learn how to manage a farm. Okay, fine. But you also have the universities where people study who are going to be educators later, and they are aware. They have a desire to create an identity also in these regions, which to many are the villains of the area. But it's important to see how to use education so as to create a new identity in the area. I think that is going to be a part and parcel of the very diversity of the identities in the Amazon. And I think that is paramount, in my opinion. And that's why I think the issue of education plays a fundamental role. May I add just two issues which I remembered? The first, unfortunately, I spent my New Year's Eve in Sinop, unfortunately, doing field work for my master's. And during that field trip, one of the moments I had was the museum of Sinop, which there was a person, there was a kid working there. He's an agronomy student, I think, at the Federal University of Mato Grosso, I think. Well, my research, this was the very end of my dissertation. I was photographing single chestnut trees, castañeras, solitary ones you cannot cut, and sometimes you have a solitary one in the middle of monoculture. It's very impressive to have this single tree. It's a very strong and crazy symbol of modernity because you have this one single huge tree. This tree alone doesn't make any sense. There needs to be a series of relations between the forest and the peoples that help it grow. One thing that I saw is the struggle in Mato Grosso for extending the frontier of the Cerrado so that the legal Amazon doesn't count in several farms, because the legal Amazon has to be 80% of a rural property of a farm, and in the Cerrado, in Campos Gerais, it's smaller. It's just 20 to 35%. So you have this struggle, although, well, you want to integrate. No, this is not the Amazon. This is Cerrado, although you have the pictures of the Pioneer Front and the deforestation showing in the museum the forest. Clearly an Amazonic biome. And this kid in the museum, we asked them, and this interaction of trying to understand the struggle, what is the Sinop biome? And he's a study of agronomy. He said, it's Cerrado. He was like, no, this is just Cerrado here. And I did a report recently on the USP Agronomical College, which had a really negative repercussion amongst the students, denouncing agribusiness, especially pesticides in Exalc, Bayer, and other multinationals. And I think talking about education is also talking about the education of agronomy in Brazil, in the Southeast and Midwest. It's people that come up to these farms, and they are in these migratory fronts. So talking about that, we have to see how the Southeastern agronomers learn about the Amazon, which is a project which is very complicated. You have these interests, these lobbying by these companies. Another issue. Julia, you have to close very quickly. We had a mobilization, an indigenous mobilization in Belém for indigenous education. There was a project of the government of destroying indigenous education, and the indigenous movement managed to revoke that law after occupying the Secretary of Education for 23 days. It was a historic mobilization. Thank you. Sorry.
So now we're over time, but we will finish now, and I'm not trying to resume this event. I hope you follow our suggestion to read the whole atlas, and including also maybe my suggestion, The Myth of the Big Cobra, which was written by Mael Anhanga Jibeleng, and he is also the artist that worked on the cover with us, and all the beautiful visuals that you see. And yeah, we're very excited to continue working with the Atlas here in Germany over the coming month for the COP, but also after the COP. And now on the final slide, you will find the QR codes where you can download the English version. And if you want, don't forget to subscribe for our Latin America newsletter here in Berlin, so we can inform you about the print version of the Amazon Atlas. And before you go, I also encourage you to take a look at the last days of the program of the Amazon Week, because there's still some activities happening, and there's also hosted in the Brazilian Embassy a nice exhibition until the 4th of July called The Earth is the Womb of Time, which is very beautiful. It was inaugurated last week and talks a lot about the archaeology also. and the colonial responsibility to, Imme mentioned this article. She unfortunately already had to leave, but she would also like to thank our wonderful guests this afternoon, and I would like to thank the interpreters today, Kirsten Grunert and Flavio Ribeiro over there, and also to my very dedicated team, especially Victor Souza and Isabella Noy, who are here with us this afternoon, and of course my colleagues from the event management and the technicians over there who made this possible, and the live stream also. And now everyone who's here in the room, we can invite you downstairs to have some snacks and some drinks and a little bit of networking if you want. And I want to thank you, the restaurant, La Choza de la Anaconda, who is a Peruvian restaurant who's doing the catering this afternoon. And thanks again all for joining the event, and afterwards have a safe trip home. Thank you very much.